Hey y'all, welcome back to another week of CFB picks. This week we're talking the upcoming top 10 matchup between Penn State and Michigan on the 15th, this coming Saturday. Kickoff's at around 12, and currently the spread is right at about 7 to 9 points, depending on where you're placing your bets. Before we break down this one, I just want to give a quick thanks to all those who tuned in last week for kind of a mixing it up preview featuring TCU and Kansas and that pretty intriguing Big 12 showdown. Looks like the model got it right on, had a 7-point spread, though the under-over ended up being a little bit higher there. I'm going to try to do a few more high-profile, or at least relatively high-profile games throughout the year, especially during Penn State's bye weeks. So if you see an upcoming matchup you really like, I probably won't get to it this week, but throw it in the comments, and I'll be happy to make a video for that, particularly on the bye weeks. So getting into this one, we'll start with Penn State. So the last time they played 2 weeks ago now against Northwestern, it was a bit of a weather-dictated outcome, I think, in some extents. Also just a matter of Penn State's offense straight up struggling. I think the score doesn't tell the entire story. Penn State had 360 total yards, still pretty low to Northwestern's 241, but I would have expected them to put up a few more points, and I think they would have, except they turned the ball over 5 times, and Northwestern turned it over 3 times. So I think that was a big indicator into why this game was a little bit lower scoring, especially for Penn State, than I thought it was going to be. You can also tell that Penn State's game approach was really impacted by the weather. They only had 20 passes attempted. While Penn State's passing isn't necessarily prolific or elite, it seems to get them out of tough situations, namely the Purdue game. And I think the passing game also really showed up against Auburn, though that was definitely aided by Auburn's turnovers and their kind of whole team imploding near the end of that one when things got difficult for that team after a few bad breaks and injuries, etc. Looking at Penn State's stats going into this game, their yards per rush is still at 4.9, even after only gaining 3.8 per rush last week. I think the 4.9 could arguably be a little bit higher. They just played a game in the rain that, quite frankly, a lot of other teams in college football didn't play in the same conditions. So looking at this game, I think you could expect maybe a higher rushing or yards per rush value than at least the stats to date for Penn State indicate. We also have seen that their rush defense week in and week out has really showed up, and I think that is reflected in their average rush yards against per game at just under 80. Going on from there, I think in this week, they're going to be going up against a pretty well-balanced offense in Michigan. I don't know if they're, one of the best in the country. They definitely aren't, but I think you can make the argument they're maybe a top 20 offense. And I think in order to stop that offense, you're going to have to really improve on the rush, or not the rush, but rather the pass defense. Penn State's giving up 251 pass yards per game, and their average opponent rank is 86, so that's 86 out of 131 total teams is the average rank each team is. Michigan is quite a bit better than that, at roughly 5th in the country. You can make an argument for 4th as well. So I think that's going to be one of the deciding factors looking into this game. Going on from there, the yards per pass for Penn State is at 7.61, which is good, not great, but you're theoretically moving the chains every other throw. So that's definitely not a bad place to be. And then their explosiveness is at a 0.08 just about. So I would put that maybe in the roughly the top third of at least teams that I've looked at this year. It's probably closer to the top quarter of college football, if not a little bit better. I haven't done the numbers, but that's where I would assume this value is at. So they're scoring points relatively effectively is one way to look at it. So getting into Michigan, last week they had a pretty good showing against Indiana. Left a couple points on the field with blocked field goals, but their offense looked very balanced. I think their offensive line, it's kind of hard to tell by that game, but I think they have a good unit. I'm not sure they're elite by any extent. Their stats are somewhat similar to Penn State, actually, and if on a few levels. They're putting up a few more points per game at 458, and then their yards against per game is at 246. Notably, their pass yards are at 165 against per game, so that's quite a bit better than Penn State, and I'll allude to it now. I think that's going to give Penn State struggles, especially if they find themselves in a hole in this game. The pass game, I think, while not elite, it's what I think Penn State is going to leverage to win games that, where maybe they're trailing or maybe they shouldn't, at least on paper. That being said, their strength of schedule is at 91. Michigan, definitely at the start of the year, did not play very good teams. 3 of them were in the bottom 20, I believe, of college football. So I think there's something to be said for that. The 9.12 yards per pass, I don't expect that to hold up in this game. 5.4 yards per rush, I don't expect to hold up either, but that's more so, if not entirely, due to Penn State's rush defense to date. Also notably, their explosiveness is at about a 0.0938, which is pretty good. That's one of the highest, if not highest, numbers I've seen this year from the teams that I've broken down. So I think that's definitely a value to look at, especially in terms of people, year in and year out, kind of these two teams play, say, oh, it's going to be a low-scoring affair, which I'm thinking this game will end up being, but it's some food for thought headed into the picks for this model. So on that topic, we'll get into the game projection here. Actually, one more note. As I alluded to, Michigan's schedule so far, they've really dominated all of the poorly ranked teams they've played, but they've also shown they can struggle against competition that's definitely not elite, namely Maryland. Just looking at the stats from that game, Maryland put up 269 through the air. They did it on 39 attempts, which makes it less impressive. But 7.0 or 6.9 to 7.0 yards per pass is good, not great. Their rushing, though, was held to 3.8 yards per carry, so not exactly effective, but it was at least still something they could use to get yards here and there. And really, if this game had played out a little bit differently on the turnover ratio, I kind of like Maryland winning this game. Turnovers were 3-1, 3 turnovers for Maryland and 1 for Michigan, and it ended up being, a one-score game. So I'm not trying to relate this game to how it's going to play out against Penn State, but I won't be surprised if this is a one-score game, especially if Penn State kind of executes the passing attack as Maryland did. I really think Maryland came in with a good gameplay strategy. The time of possession in this game was 32-28, so on paper it looks like a very even game. Though I think Michigan's talent and definitely their defense as well is what really kind of gave them the edge in this one. So with that in mind, we'll get into the picks for this game. So right now, the model has us at 30.1 to 19.6 for Michigan. That's a little bit more than I think most betting platforms have the spread at. Going through some of the models, projected totals. For the rush, it doesn't see either team doing well, and that I think is to be expected. Michigan at 2.02 yards per carry, Penn State at 2.12. I'll be surprised if the numbers are actually that low. I think, gameplay strategy is going to come into, probably getting those numbers up a bit. But I think it's definitely saying here that I don't think this game is going to be won on the ground unless one of the two defenses doesn't show up. Meanwhile, for projected pass yards per play, Michigan at 8.56 is a pretty darn good number, especially against a good, not elite Penn State pass defense. Meanwhile, Penn State's projected to have only 5 yards per attempt. That number definitely influenced by the Northwestern game. But, at the end of the day, when you look at this player per player, I think an argument can be made that both of these offenses are very similar. They both have more than capable backs. Singleton is probably a little bit better than Corum, but I think they match up at least, decently well. At receiver, I think Penn State has a little bit more depth. At quarterback, I would say McCarthy is definitely a more refined passer than Clifford. And I think athletically they're comparable. So at the end of the day, this leads my pick to be 31-24. The way I look at this game is both teams are really good, but I think at the end of the day, Michigan is at least as good as, maybe with the exception of the rush defense, but they're at least as good as, if not ever so slightly better than Penn State at everything else, both on or especially on the offensive side of the ball. Though I think you can definitely make a case for Penn State's rush game. They have way more depth at running back, and probably a little bit more depth at receiver. I think it's really going to be, can Penn State's top backs deliver better than Corum, especially given that Penn State's offensive line, I think, is a notch or two lower than Michigan's. So right now I have this game picked at 31-24. I see this as a one-score game for the reasons I just mentioned. I think that the paths for Penn State to win are really going to come down to, can their pass defense show improvement, or can blitz schemes put pressure on Michigan to kind of hamper their pass game. But for right now, what I see is that in Michigan's pass offense, which is definitely, their numbers have definitely been influenced by their strength of schedule. But if that pass defense is for real, for lack of a better way to put it, I think that's going to give Penn State major issues. At least in the numbers, that's the one major advantage, is Michigan's pass offense versus Penn State's pass defense. I think on Saturday that's going to be the matchup to watch. If Penn State can somehow find a way to, minimize the amount of yards that Michigan gets through the air, which I think they're very capable of, especially through Diaz's blitz schemes, they can get pressure on McCarthy. I really think that could keep Penn State in this game. If not, I think it's probably going to be more of a 10-point game if Michigan really finds an advantage in the passing. So with that being said, 31-24 is what my pick is. Throw your pick in the comments, and be sure to like and subscribe for future videos. Thanks.